Reconstructionist Radio presents Justice in His Kingdom, examining the religious nature of justice, with Jerry Lynn Ward and Roger Oliver.
Hello, I'm Roger Oliver with Jerry Lynn Ward. Welcome to Justice in the Kingdom. Our guest today is Stephen Baskerville, author of The New Politics of Sex, The Sexual Revolution, Civil Liberties, and the Growth of Government Power. Stephen is a retired professor of government at Patrick Henry College and research fellow at the Howard Center for Family, Religion, and Society and the Independent Institute. He may be retired from that as well. He writes on comparative international politics and on political ideology, with an emphasis on religion, family policy, and sexuality. His writings appear in such publications as the Washington Post, the American Spectator, the National Review, among others. He has appeared on national and international radio and television programs, including The O'Reilly Factor, Hardball with Chris Matthews, The Dennis Prager Show, and The Michael Medved Show, among others. Welcome, Stephen.
Thank you.
There's a quote on page 14. Let's start with that. It says, sexual politics, as the term originators made clear, is an ideology that uses sexuality as an instrument to satisfy the human craving for power. Starting with that, connect up for us the subtitle, the Sexual Revolution, Civil Liberties, and the Growth of Government Power. Briefly, what we'd like to do is focus on Chapter 3, and especially the civil liberty part, but connect up for that for our listeners, those three issues.
Well, one of the main themes of the book is the idea of ideology, sexual ideology, or what some people are now calling gender ideology. And the book is not about the cultural impact of the sexual revolution or about sexuality itself. It's specifically about the political impact, the impact on government policy, and the role of government policy in promoting the sexual revolution itself. My field is government, political science. So I focus on that, which other people haven't done so much. And my argument is that there is a gender, or as I call it, a sexual ideology. It is similar in some ways, the successor in some ways to Marxist ideology, fascist ideology, nationalist ideology, the great ideologies of the modern world. And this is the latest one. It's not based on economic or social factors like Marxism is. It's not based on nationality or ethnicity or race like nationalism is. It's based on sexuality, and it uses sexuality as a currency, as a political currency, a means to acquire political power. One of the manifestations of this is the enormous growth of government power for many reasons that I detail in the book. And consequently, the corollary is the restriction on individual freedom and civil liberties.
Yes. I read, you mentioned E. Michael Jones' Libido Dominandi, Sexual Liberation and Political Control, which I read cover to cover. And reading your book was like reading an update, a continuation of the same thing. It's an ancient problem, it seems to me. But so it's not new per se, although it seems like it is. These now, on Chapter 3, Criminalizing Sex and Gender Crimes, on page 105, it says, you write, in America, basic civil liberties and procedural safeguards are now routinely ignored. Grand juries are neutered, frivolous prosecutions abound, and the innocent are railroaded into prison through plea bargains and other high-pressure devices that border on extortion. Walk us through how this has happened with some examples.
Well, first of all, what you said about ideology, I would just comment that sexual ideology has kind of tagged along with many of the other great revolutions and ideologies of recent history. For example, the Russian Revolution, the French Revolution, even the American Revolution to some extent had elements of feminist ideology in them, and the fascist movements had elements of homosexualist ideology in them. This is all well documented. I'm not the first to point this out. What I've argued is that here we see that this sexual ideology has kind of emerged from the margins where it was in past forms of radicalism, and it's really seen it's achieved its own day in the sun. It's the dominant one, I argue, on the political left. As far as the curtailment, the constricting of personal freedom and civil liberties, there's many ways that this happens. I started my previous book, focused on the divorce industry. And I was quite shocked when I began to investigate the divorce industry and to go beyond the cliches about ugly divorce and nasty custody battle. And I was very shocked to find how the rights, especially of parents, were severely constricted immediately the moment that they were pulled into a divorce, even if they were completely legally unimpeachable, guilty of no or suspected of no legal infraction whatsoever. Their children were seized, their bank accounts were seized, they could be thrown out of their home. Um, I can detail that more if you like, but that's where I started this in my previous book called Taken into Custody. The
Can
more
I
I
interject
examined
right
the section,
now?
I'm sorry?
Dr. Baskerville, can I interject? Because on the same topic as taken into custody, one thing that I'm extremely interested in as an attorney is how all of this has impacted the justice system. And one thing I found very interesting in taken into custody was what you wrote in there about no fault divorce. Can you just kind of divert from uh, the newest book and just explain to the folks out there, especially in Texas, how no fault divorce came about?
Well, yes, it's a very interesting question because there again, I was shocked to go beyond the cliches about no fault divorce and discover what it really meant. It's a it's a completely innovative legal concept. The idea of no fault justice, of course, is a contradiction in terms. I discovered there's no such thing as no fault justice, um, and I found that because of this introduction of this innovative principle, it was setting aside all of the procedural safeguards, excuse me, all the procedural safeguards that one normally expects in a judicial procedure within the system of the English common law. Um, uh, there was the presumption of innocence was set aside. Innocent people could be deprived of their most basic rights under the common law for simply the fact that it's the only procedure I know of so far where a completely legally innocent person suspected of no wrongdoing can be summoned to court and find himself or herself the object of directives, government orders issued curtailing their personal freedom, including their right to be with their own children, their right to raise their own children, their right to be in their own home, in some cases, their right to their property. Um, all of these basic civil rights are just routinely ignored. In fact, I go through in that book, I go down the Bill of Rights point by point, and I show that virtually every article in the Bill of Rights, the U.S. Bill of Rights, is routinely violated in family court. And this has never been refuted. Nobody has ever challenged any point in that book. It's all accepted. They come up with various excuses and cliches like, oh well, this is the divorce. It's a harsh matter. But you know, the violation of basic constitutional rights is just astounding. So the divorce system undercuts all of the protection. It introduced a poison into the legal system, and I predicted in that first book that this was not going to be quarantined, if you excuse the term. This could not be limited simply to the divorce system. Once you introduce these principles into the law, these precedents, they will spread to other parts of the law. Other places, people's rights will be taken away. You can't, as Martin Luther King used to say, an injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. You can't just limit these principles to one sphere of the judiciary. And so then after having written Taken into Custody, I began to explore the sexual revolution more generally, more widely. And I found that many of the principles, the patterns, the models, the things which I had found with the divorce industry was already being replicated elsewhere in the political and legal systems. It became a pattern, a larger pattern, which I began to see in other areas of not only the law, but of government policy, of executive and legislative policy as well. So the newest book, The New Politics of Sex, is an effort to show this larger pattern and a kind of modus operandi that now operates throughout the whole sexual revolution and its political manifestations.
Well, much of the criminalization comes not from prosecution of existing crimes, but from the proliferation of new ones and from the politicization of the criminal justice system. That's a quote. Everywhere elsewhere, you point out that these new crimes are vaguely defined, and this leads to arbitrary and selective enforcement. Can you give us some other examples? For example, I just read this morning that one of the problems with this lockdown is that the terms of the lockdown are vaguely defined, and they're often arbitrarily applied and abused by the police forces. There's a big complaint, but and it seems to me like that's an extension of exactly what you wrote about in the book. Am I right?
It could well be, yes, it could well be. What I refer to in the book is what I call gender crimes, and we've seen these
Right.
on the front pages in the last few years. Gender crimes are just general crimes of so-called crimes of a sexual nature, but they're, as you say, vague. They're not clearly defined. Terms like sexual harassment, sexual abuse, sexual misconduct. We hear these all the time. Now, are these things crimes? Are they civil infractions? Are they simply matters of personal rudeness? What exactly is their status in the law? It's very, very unclear. Even something the most sensational of all, probably, are sexual assault and rape, which would seem to be a fairly clear-cut, straightforward matter. But in fact, we are seeing throughout the law in many countries now that rape has been, as the feminists say, redefined to mean something other than what plain English suggests it means. I think we all know what rape means in plain English. But just like domestic violence, actually was the first one of these. So we all know what violence means in plain English. But according to the law now, in many jurisdictions, domestic violence can include insults. It can include name calling. It can include what is called psychological violence, which is a meaningless term. It can include what's called economic violence, which is a term that generally means refusing someone's demands for money. But again, it has no precise definition. So where domestic violence shades off into sexual harassment, or where sexual harassment shades off into sexual assault, where that shades off into rape, these are extremely vague and unclear. And what it means is that a person, if you want to accuse somebody, you can find something in the hodgepodge, something in the community chest of crimes, new crimes, to pin on that person. You can make the defendant fit the crime rather than the other way around.
One of the related problems is throwing out the rules of evidence. An accusation is taken as evidence to convict someone. I saw that, and we saw that. It's a light went on reading this about the Kavanaugh hearings, what was happening there. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yes, the
issue of evidence.
Right. Again, many of this, the epicenter of this, the font from which much of this proceeded was the divorce system, where people would be, where there was no evidence required, because with no fault divorce, you're not necessarily required to be guilty of any legal infraction. But you could see this spread from there, for example, again, to domestic violence, where most people accused of domestic violence are not tried before a jury of their peers. They're never either convicted or acquitted of anything. This is the way we think of crime, as something you're formally charged, your evidence is brought forward, you're either acquitted, in which case you're left alone, or you're convicted, in which case you're punished legally. With domestic violence, that doesn't happen. Generally, the accused is simply removed from the home, because in most cases, a domestic violence accusation, the purpose of that is to gain advantage in a divorce case. So the person is typically removed from the father. Typically, the man is typically removed from the home, incarcerated temporarily for a weekend or a week or a month, and then forced to undergo some kind of government mandated psychotherapy classes of some kind for batterers. And one study I've found, I quote in the book, showed that no one accused of domestic violence was ever acquitted. Everybody was punished in some way. It may not mean a jail term or prison, but they would be punished with some kind of community service, or usually some kind of a batterer's course, a class, which is very time consuming and very expensive.
Can I ask a follow-up question to that? Because as a female who came of age during the heyday of the beginning of feminism in the late 60s, early 70s, I know that women thought this was a way to liberty. All this was a way to liberty. Why do you think they thought that? And what has this resulted in for women? Because I don't see it as liberty. What do you think?
Well, this is a very interesting point, and this is another of the themes of the book, is that there's two aspects, two sides of the sexual revolution. There's the libertarian side, and there's the authoritarian side, and they work in conjunction with each other. It's a dialectic. And it's not chronological, although in the beginning we did think of this as a matter of, sexual liberation, women's liberation, and so forth, free sex. What harm does it do? Who's it hurting? If we have sex out of wedlock, or as much as we want for recreation. So there was this, and there still is, this libertarian side, which says that sex should be free, it should be uninhibited, it's no business of the government, or not only the government, it's no business of anybody. Even your own family members or your own church members or your own friends have no right to interfere or tell you in any way that what you're doing may be unwise. So it's this highly, highly libertarian attitude towards sex. But the corollary with this, which we're only, it's been present for a long time now, but it's not clearly associated. But I try to delineate this in the book. The corollary to the libertarian sexuality is the authoritarian sexuality, the crimes. Let's have free sex. Let's not inhibit people toward having sex. But the free sex in the evening turns into a rape accusation in the morning. Divorce is, again, another thing. What right does the government have to force us to continue a marriage? We should have the right to divorce at whim without even having to give any grounds. Well, the divorce, the free divorce, quickly becomes an accusation it becomes an accusation of domestic violence. It removes one of the spouses or parents from the home. It forces the other parents away from his children, and basically deprives the children of one parent, usually the father. So, in fact, the divorce machinery, as I say in both books, is the most repressive government machinery ever created in the Western world. Or sorry, it's not in the Western world, but in the English-speaking world. Sorry. And so all through this sexual revolution, you can see this, the freedom on the one hand, homosexuals demanding sexual freedom, freedom to practice their lifestyle in private, which most people don't dispute. But then they turn around and start demanding controls on what other people can say and do, and opinions and so forth, and demand protection from criticism, immunity from criticism, and to criticize homosexuality or homosexual politics or the homosexual lifestyle becomes a hate crime for which you can then be punished, legally punished or prosecuted. So this is what has to be understood. And this is what nobody's really pointed out. You mentioned E. Michael Jones. He points this out in theory. He points this out in literary ways. So you're right. My book is an attempt to come along and show how his prophecy, if you like, about the libertarian and the authoritarian has been fulfilled in very concrete government measures.
Yes.
I think what you're describing is what I know one writer termed anarcho-tyranny, anarchy combined with tyranny.
That's a good point. Yes, I mean, it's a very good point. Every revolution promises freedom. I mean, that's one of the great promises of every revolution, from the English, the French Revolution, the Russian Revolution, the Chinese, the Iranian. They all promised freedom from tyranny, from the king or from the Shah or from the dictator. And then they turned around and some of them, not all, some of them turned around and imposed tyranny far more repressive and draconian than that which they overthrew. First, you have the rights of man in the French Revolution, and then you have the reign of terror. It's uncanny how the sexual revolution, even though it hasn't overthrown governments yet in a violent way, is following this same kind of pattern that we've seen throughout modern history.
Yeah, the French Revolution was permeated with the same problem. I see a connection, maybe between all of this and identity politics, what they're calling identity politics. There are certain groups that are assumed to be innocent because they belong to a group, and there's a particular group in this that you point out that is always assumed to be guilty, and it's actually attacking the very foundations of the social order based on the family. Maybe you could connect the dots for us a little bit.
Yes, this is, I mean, again, this is another area where we preached in the 60s and 70s. We preached, personal freedom, personal liberation, but we didn't limit it to personal freedom from the state. we spread it to. We wanted personal freedom not only from the repression of the government, but we also wanted personal freedom from family norms, family the religion. Religion was cast as
Right.
in a villainous role. So even
Mhm.
private forms of admonition or private forms of advice and morals and traditions, these also were cast into the flames, along with the state. And so what happened was we created this huge vacuum where there were no norms, there were no all of the traditional values and norms, not only the government, the legal ones, legal constraints, but moral constraints, religious constraints, families, friends, anybody who said anything about critical of our lifestyle was consigned to to a villainous role. So this vacuum opened up where there were no values, and that vacuum has been filled by radical ideology. And this is another theme of the book that I mentioned is the way that what they've really done is they've redefined sin. They've really created the sexual revolutionaries have destroyed the old definition of sin, religion, religious definitions, those enforced by the family, by the neighborhood, by the friends, by the congregation, and replaced it with a government definition of sin: sexual harassment, sexual abuse, sexual assault, sexual this and sexual that. And this new definition of sin, this really crime is what it is not enforced by community norms, by non-coercive forms of pressure, of sanctions. It's enforced by the gendarmerie. It's enforced by the police and by the courts and by the lawyers and by the jailers, ultimately. So we've thrown out morals and we've replaced morals with ideology. And this is a very, very dangerous trend. You can see it, for example. I found this first of all in the divorce industry, where when it used to be, if a couple was having problems in their marriage, they were supported by the larger family, their parents, their friends, their neighbors, maybe therapists. But this all went out the window. This was considered so family members and the church, of course, the church would help out. The church would intervene, and if necessary, the church or the family or the extended family would knock their heads together and tell them who's right and who's wrong and who's what's. Well, this all went out the window. Everyone decided, well, this is judgmental and we mustn't do this. So who fills that vacuum when a couple is having difficulties in their marriage? Who knocks their heads together? Who comes in and sorts it out? Lawyers, judges, government psychotherapists, and they don't. And it's a very blunt weapon that we use, and they have their own self-interest, their own bureaucratic interest as well. So that's where we're at.
Well, I noticed too something very interesting to point out is not only are such religious ideas and community ideas that used to exist ridiculed, in some cases are criminalized. It's criminalizing political dissent.
Absolutely, yes, it is. I'm quite shocked about this, and it has reached that point. It then turns around. Not only are the non-political forms of criticism, ridiculed and belittled, but it gets to the point where they are not tolerated legally as well. And that's true. I have a whole section of the book showing how the divorce system, for example, and other aspects of the sexual revolution are having an extreme impact on religious freedom, religious criticism of homosexuality, criticism of feminism, is increasingly defined as a hate crime and punished. Parents' decisions about the upbringing of their children, for example, the religious upbringing or the education of their children, are routinely curtailed. Again, that started with divorce cases, but there's no reason it has to be limited to divorce cases. It can be extended out from there to any parents. So it's yes, these radical ideas do not tolerate rivals.
No.
Dr. Baskerville, you've talked a little bit about the role of the church in all this and the role that the church once had. What is your thought? How has the church allowed itself to be marginalized and essentially silenced in all this? Do you have any ideas about that?
Yes, I do. I didn't write about that a lot in the books, but I have written about it since in some articles, especially in Crisis Magazine, where I'm quite shocked at how little the churches have had to say in the sexual revolution. It seems to me that if you look at these very concrete violations of freedom and constitutional rights and so forth, the churches should be in a great position to be standing up and say, to be frank, I told you so. I mean, this is a vindication of everything the churches have been saying for centuries, that sexual freedom does lead to tyranny, that it doesn't limit itself to, it's not just a bunch of scolding Aunt Sallies, telling us off for being naughty. There are concrete reasons the churches have always been opposed to, for example, sex outside marriage. Look at you go back to the Puritans and the problem of the Elizabethan Poor Law. Sex outside marriage creates, what used to be called bastards, and then illegitimate children, and but they created huge problems of crime, poverty, huge expenses of the parish. So that there's reasons. Single parenthood has been connected with virtually every social pathology today, from violent crime to truancy, to substance abuse. It's the number one cause of social pathologies. So why aren't the churches standing up and saying this vindicates everything we've said about the negative, destructive social impact of sexual freedom? And yet the churches are saying nothing. You hear nothing about this from the churches, and I'm just appalled. And this should be their day in the sun as far as standing up. And I found this again. This started in the divorce system. In a divorce system, if a couple's having trouble, the church is the pastor who marries them. They have a stake in the divorce system, and yet they do nothing. And so, what does the couple do? They go to lawyers. They go to the judges. Even then, why can't the church intervene in a legal case? If there's a legal divorce, the church, it seems to me, has a standing as an interested party. They consecrated the marriage. In the Catholic Church, it's a sacrament. And then the state comes along and takes that same marriage covenant and simply tears it up. Well, it seems to me that gives the churches a standing to enter the courtroom and say, you have no right to tear this contract up. And you have an obligation to see to the well-being and the justice of all the parties concerned. And yet the churches never do this. I've never known a church intervene in a positive way in a divorce case or any other prosecution for a sexual matter.
Yeah. There's another problem here is the avarice that perverts justice. You mentioned in passing this huge divorce industry and family law and all the people that are involved in that have a benefit, a motivation, an incentive to perpetuate it. And the target group is, as you point out, is heterosexual men. And the word patriarchy is just right out of the pit of hell, according to this. Comment on that a little bit for us.
Well, yes.
Again,
we have this.
Of it. Yeah.
We have this, very deferential attitude, many of us, to lawyers and judges and courts. The judges wear robes as if they're priests, and we treat them as the fonts of justice. But they're not any more objective or disinterested or impartial than anyone else. They are interested parties. In many ways, courts have become bureaucratic agencies like any other, especially divorce cases, but others as well. The bureaucracies notoriously create the problems and perpetuate the problems that they're supposed to be solving, because they have a self-interest, and they have no self-interest in solving the problem. Their self-interest is to extend the problem and perpetuate it. So courts, it's well known, and I show this in the book, how courts basically encourage, not only encourage, they force divorce on people who don't want it. They punish people who try to save their marriages. The courts always take the side of the almost always take the side of the guilty party, and encourage wrongdoing. So the courts are not disinterested parties, and neither are the bureaucratic the welfare agencies are not either. The forensic psychotherapists, not the independent psychotherapists, but those who make their living off court cases, they too all are essentially functionaries, bureaucrats, and they have a self-interest in perpetuating the very problems they're supposed to be solving. So it's not, you can see this in the child protective services. Child protective services are supposed to be protecting children from child abuse. And yet they create the very single parent homes where almost all the child abuse takes place. If you look at child abuse, it's almost entirely a phenomenon of single parent homes. And yet social workers and child abuse agents are almost entirely feminists who do their best to break up families, remove fathers from their home, and they create the very environment where child abuse is most likely to occur. And the judges back them up on this because they all know that this is good for their business. I'm sorry to put it so harshly, but it's inescapable.
It is what it is, as they say nowadays.
Yeah. These counselors get paid through the courts, and I don't do family law, but I have done a few CPS cases, and so have run into the kind of counselor that the courts always want to appoint, and that CPS always wants appointed, and they do not have traditional values at all. And I mean, my experience with them was that I thought they were screwballs.
Yeah.
Well, you're not alone in that. I do have some bits on forensic psychotherapy, and I emphasize the worst cases are those that are connected with the courts, because they do have an incentive to break up families, and I'm not the only one who's investigated the psychotherapy industry and come to very harsh conclusions about it. And it is striking. They don't have an incentive to solve or to heal people, as they claim. They have an incentive to flame tensions as well, and that's precisely what they do.
They forward their own agendas, feminist agendas.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. Well, something else you point out is there's a lot. This thing is loaded with assertions with no evidence or argument, and you actually document and footnote many statistics that directly contradict this. Things like the proliferation of rape and domestic abuse and child abuse and sex trafficking that is contributing to this. There's an assumption of guilt, assumption of these numbers are true, and we have lost our objectivity. We lost our minds, and I had to chuckle at once you said there, and I can't remember exactly how you said it, but you said you can't contradict their arguments because they really don't have any arguments.
Yes. No, it is striking, and in my own field, as a social scientist, I can see how this does terrible violence to the integrity of the social sciences, because it just doesn't mean anything. I mean, the truth doesn't; it just goes out the window. I can show you peer-reviewed articles that are completely the opposite of the truth. And I'm not some of the issues I address in the book have already been thoroughly addressed by others. Some of them have not. For example, the rape statistics are very clear. It's very clear. Basically the hysteria that's being fomented now over rape is precisely that. There's just too many reputable, clear studies that have shown that this is basically a hoax. Domestic violence is also the case, and yet public policy is just completely oblivious to these. The Congress, the courts. Carry on with things like the Violence Against Women Act and others, which have no basis in reality, or well, they almost certainly exacerbate the problem.
The flip side is that the real guilty often get away. It's too easy to prosecute the weak victim, the person that obeys the law.
Yes, that's very much the case. Yeah, that's right. And of course, the idea that it's also easier, as a number of people that I quote point this out, it's easier to prosecute law-abiding citizens than dangerous criminals. The police have become increasingly bureaucratic agencies who find it easier to deal with law-abiding citizens who won't hurt them than to deal with hardened criminals who present serious problems.
Yes. How do conservatives get it wrong and get duped into? There's a couple of issues there that you develop. Help us to understand where we're getting it wrong.
Yes, I do. I do make some harsh judgments about conservatives, and I'm very disappointed in that, because it is striking that conservatives have many of the right criticisms of the sexual revolution. They tend to be correct, but they don't follow it through. They then turn around and endorse measures that do not solve the problem, but make the problem worse. Oftentimes because those measures are politically popular. So, for example, conservatives lament sexual freedom, they lament divorce, they generally disapprove of feminism, and yet they approve measures like the Violence Against Women Act, which is a measure ostensibly against domestic violence, but in fact, which creates huge incentives for states to break up families and to remove innocent fathers, from their homes and their children, and raise more fatherless children. Another example, a horrible example that I describe in some detail, is the child support system. The child support
Mm-hmm.
system provides huge negative incentives, very negative, very bad incentives to break families up. It is not a way of providing for children whose fathers have absconded and abandoned them. It is a way of subsidizing single parents and removing innocent fathers from their home, and it provides an incentive to do it because you can take their cash once they're removed from their children. So it provides incentives not only for mothers but also for government officials, state officials, to encourage divorce, to remove the father from the home, to confiscate everything he has, to put him in jail, um, because it fills up the government coffers. So
Mm-hmm.
it's just a diabolical system.
Yes. Well, of course, we trust. I believe personally that it's unsustainable. And as you look at history, and of course, our perspective is that Christ still owns history, and it goes on so long and it gets corrected. It may be a couple of generations, but what do you see as some things we could do to attack this in our generation, beginning right now? Practical things, perhaps.
Many of the solutions that I offer in the books are solutions that are actually very simple in terms of
Mm-hmm.
they don't require elaborate government engineering, social engineering. They don't require elaborate bureaucracies or spending. The most simple solution would be to simply enforce the Constitution. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
it's pretty clear that if you take the Bill of Rights seriously, that most of these practices are horribly unconstitutional.
Mm-hmm.
The one measure I would perhaps is not provided for in the Constitution is the rights of parents, and I've endorsed myself the parental rights amendment that's been before Congress for a number of years, and variations on it, which would render the rights of parents to the care, custody, and companionship of their own children a basic fundamental constitutional right. But other than that, even that arguably is implicit in the Constitution already, and
Mm-hmm.
has been, I think, upheld by numerous federal court cases, precedents. So basically, if we enforce the Constitution, that's what it would take. But it's the political difficulty of enforcing the Constitution.
Mm-hmm.
It's the ignorance, I have to say, of many of our public officials, and many of us, our own ignorance, that we've lost the close connection, the awareness that we've once had in this country for the rights, for our constitutional rights, the jealousy that Americans have traditionally had for protecting the freedoms of the Constitution, I think, has been diluted seriously. The legal profession has been corrupted in many ways, which we think of the guardians. The media have not done their job to call attention to these abuses. In fact, in many cases, they've been cheerleaders for the abuses themselves. So I think the first thing we need to do is recover is general public awareness. And I think what you're doing here, the conservative media, the Christian media, the alternative media, libertarian media, in some cases, needs to do more of what they're trying to do. I realize, and that is bring these to public attention, to uncompromisingly, ruthlessly, if you like, bring these things to public awareness, even if they have to slay some conservative sacred cows in order to do it.
Yes. Well, one of the first steps to conquer these things, be informed, and that's why I highly recommend the book.
Yeah, we're going on 40 minutes right now, but one thing I'd like you to address, Dr. Baskerville, is you have put a lot of time and effort into these books and your writings, and I'm just interested in what it was that motivated you to write about these things and to try to warn people about what was going on with respect to the issues that you've been writing about.
Yeah, well, I came across a number of these cases. As everyone does nowadays. You can't avoid it. It's just that everyone in the Western world has friends, family members themselves who have come across many cases of divorce or accusations of sexual harassment or rape. Or, I've known colleagues in the academic world who've been thrown out of work for trying to bring, to talk, write about these things. And as I as I've investigated them more carefully, I found that there was more to this than the standard cliches, the platitudes, of ugly divorce and nasty custody battle and so forth. I began to realize there was a political dimension to this. There's a political dynamic that nobody was paying attention to. And since politics is my field, I'm accustomed to analyzing politics. It's what I do. I was shocked that my own colleagues in the academic world had never gone into any of this. And I began to find the same thing in the second book with the sexual revolution. I found that here was this huge revolution in sexuality, this huge political phenomenon, and no one in the universities was exploring it in any kind of disinterested way. Sure, there's lots of people in the universities that themselves are advocates for the sexual revolution, but nobody in the universities was undertaking objective, disinterested, dispassionate scholarship to describe this the way we might describe, something of the American Revolution or the something in the past, the French Revolution. So it's shocking to me that my colleagues are all advocates for something that they shouldn't be advocating. They should be studying. They should be studying in a detached and disinterested way. So I knew something was wrong. It's very clear to me that something was amiss here. And sure enough, the more I scratched the surface, the more I found there was a huge iceberg beneath the tip of political and legal abuse that nobody was paying any attention to.
Well, do you have any future books in the works that people should be looking for?
Um, I'm working on a few right now. I'm not quite sure which one's going to come next. I thought about writing a general book on the sexual revolution, um, more generally on the cultural aspect of it. But I'm not sure at this point. I'd like to write one about the abuses of the legal system. I'm increasingly encountering um, these kinds of abuses elsewhere in the legal system besides the sexual revolution. Again, I think that this is the epicenter, the font of it. But I think it is increasingly poisoning the judiciary generally, as we saw again in the Kavanaugh case and others. This is high politics now. It's not something that just affects a few people behind closed doors. I would like to write a book on the abuses of the academic world. I'm increasingly convinced now of the corruption of the academic world. I just reviewed a new book by John Ellis on the deterioration of academics. I'm shocked at how not only left wing public universities on the government payroll, but even Christian universities, Christian colleges are themselves corrupted very seriously by ideology generally and sexual ideology in particular. They're compromising their standards and they're making their accommodation with ideology. So it's very those are my hopes. I'm not quite sure where I'm going to go from here.
That's very
Okay,
good.
I think Rogers wants to close, but I want to ask one more thing. Where can people find your writings at the present time, and do you have a website?
I do have a website. It's called stephenbaskerville.com, Stephen with a PH. I'm kind of reconstructing it, but you can see my books and many of my recent articles there. I read a lot for Crisis Magazine. My books are available on that site and on Amazon or the Barnes and Noble, the standard places as well.
I think one of the trends I observed in all of this is that we think we have disconnected and of course criminalized even the connection between our religious faith and politics and morality. We really haven't. We just replaced our Christian faith with a humanist faith, and religions in general are intolerant And so, of course, this is not an issue of politics. This is an issue of discipleship in our families and trusting that in the end, God is sovereign and He has something going on that He knows what He's doing. And this crisis that we're facing right now, I see as often a wake up for many people for this kind of injustice that we've been talking about. So, are we out of time now?
Yeah, we're coming up on 45 minutes, and I'm sure Dr. Baskerville has other
Do you have
things to
anything
do.
else? Yeah, Dr. Baskerville, do you have anything else you'd like to add? Any close?
Well, what you just said, I think was very apropos. I must do one of my favorite themes, main themes, is the development of radical ideologies in the modern world. And I'm not the first person to observe that radical ideologies are oftentimes secularized religions or pseudo religions, and I think
Right.
that's precisely the case here. These things have become feminism, homosexualism, as I call it, transgenderism. It's not just homosexuality. It's not just women. It's not just transgender people. It's the politicization of these lifestyles that is really threatening our freedom. And we've seen this before, and I think that's really what we need to be focusing on more and more.
You bet. Well, we're out of time. Thank you very much, Stephen. Once again, the book is The New Politics of Sex, The Sexual Revolution, Civil Liberties, and the Growth of Government Power. I encourage our listeners to buy it and read it, digest it. It'll discourage you, but you have to know what the enemy is if we're going to defeat it.